You were never supposed to hear this. The journals were buried, the names forgotten, and the truth, if that's what this even is, was sealed away behind layers of shame and institutional silence. But the story clawed its way back from the grave. And now, it's looking at you. 1834. Kentucky, a town so remote cartographers stopped bothering to mark it. Pine Hollow, a place stitched together by superstition, fear, and blind faith. And into that fog-choked village walked a preacher and his twin daughters, two little girls with eyes too knowing, and voices that shattered the illusion of safety forever. This isn't just a ghost story, it's a psychological autopsy. Because what happened that November wasn't supernatural, it was surgical. The kind of precision that splits open the skin of consensus reality and reveals something older and much more dangerous. Underneath, you've been told your whole life that children can't see the truth, that their words are cute, their games meaningless, their dreams disposable. But what if those were the lies? What if the most terrifying minds in history weren't shaped by trauma, but born remembering things they should never know? The Morrison twins didn't just break people, they disassembled them. In 3 days, they tore open secrets buried for generations, spoke of tragedies that hadn't happened yet, and named names they should have never known. And every word, every damn word, was verifiably, painfully true. This isn't about psychic phenomena. It's about control, information warfare, the way certain minds tap into the undercurrent of things. Those fault lines beneath society we're trained to never feel. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison were not oracles. They were scalpel blades, and someone, something, put them in Pine Hollow for a reason. By the end of this video, you'll understand why modern institutions still won't speak their names out loud, why this wasn't studied, only suppressed, and most importantly, why you were never meant to find this video, but you did. And now the door is open. Don't just watch. Listen. Don't just listen. Remember. Because when truth stares back, most men look away. But you're not most men, are you? The first thing they noticed wasn't the girls. It was the silence. When Reverend Ezekiel Morrison arrived in Pine Hollow with his daughters, the air itself seemed to hesitate, like the land was holding its breath, waiting. The town was small, less than 200 souls, all bound by blood, by doctrine, by the kind of isolation that mutates tradition into obsession. They had no sheriff, no doctor, just a wooden church, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and one man who kept records. Pastor William Phillips. He was the kind of man who believed that order could hold back chaos, that if he documented enough, tracked enough, prayed enough, he could tame whatever darkness lurked beyond the tree line. But what stepped into his chapel that November was not chaos. It was precision, wrapped in the bodies of two pale children, identical in every visible way, but opposites beneath the skin. Rebecca, the firstborn by minutes, bright, magnetic. She smiled like she already knew you, and maybe she did. Rachel, quieter. Still, not shy, just calculating, like she was watching you for something only she could see. That night, over a modest meal in the pastor's home, Rebecca looked up from her bowl of stew and asked a question no stranger could have known to ask. She asked about the rose bushes, the ones by the eastern fence, the ones that nearly died from a fungal blight 3 summers prior. Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon. No one outside the valley even knew about those roses, let alone their struggle to survive. The child just smiled, said she'd dreamed of walking in a garden and saw the most beautiful roses there, that somehow she just knew. That was the first fracture, the first whisper that something was wrong, but not in the way Pine Hollow was used to. Not demons, not witches, not superstition. This was worse, because this wasn't magic. This was memory, memory that didn't belong to them, memory that couldn't have belonged to them. And by the time the town understood what that meant, it was already too late. By morning, the wind had shifted. Colder, sharper, like something ancient had been stirred awake in the soil. Pastor Phillips rose early. The fire in the hearth had gone out, but Ezekiel Morrison was already awake, sitting motionless beside the embers, his Bible open but unread. His face was hollow, not from fatigue, from something heavier. The weight of knowing what his daughters would reveal before they even opened their mouths. They had dreamed again. But these weren't the innocent ramblings of children. These were surgical extractions. Data points. Secrets pulled like teeth from the dark. And when Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, her voice steady as stone, she didn't ask questions. She gave instructions. Beneath the altar, she said, "Third floorboard from the left. There's something hidden that shouldn't be there." And Rachel, emerging silently behind her, confirmed it, described the object, its shape, its purpose, and worst of all, its meaning, a brown bottle, wrapped in a piece of blue cloth, a baby's blanket. Pastor Phillips stopped breathing for a moment, because every detail was true. He had hidden that bottle himself. 3 months earlier, a private struggle with temptation, a moment of weakness, sealed beneath the church floor. The blanket belonged to his dead son, a symbol of failure, of grief, of everything he couldn't purge from his own soul. No one knew, not his wife, not his God. He had confessed it only in silent prayer, never spoken aloud. And yet, here it was, laid bare by a child who wasn't supposed to know his name. That was when the fear changed. Before, it was uncertainty, the quiet dread of things unexplained. Now, it was personal, violent, like standing naked before a force that sees everything you've hidden from the world, and worse, from yourself. Ezekiel said nothing, only watched, because he'd seen this before, and he knew it was only the beginning. This wasn't a gift. This wasn't a blessing. This was exposure, weaponized, and Pine Hollow was about to be dissected, one soul at a time. Sunday morning came like a knife through fog, cold, silent, and too still. The congregation filed into the chapel like they always had. Same seats, same hymns, same rituals performed to keep the unknown at bay. But nothing felt safe anymore. Not after what Rebecca and Rachel had said, not after what they knew. Ezekiel's sermon was powerful, but not unusual. A call to confession, to spiritual renewal, the kind of message frontier towns depended on to keep their fragile order intact. But it wasn't his words that tore Pine Hollow open. It was what happened after, when the service ended and the people began to rise. Rebecca moved first, straight toward Samuel Turner, the wealthiest man in the valley, respected, feared, seen as a pillar of the church. She looked up at him, smiling like a child offering a flower, and said, "It isn't really stealing if you put it back. Papa says God forgives those who repent." Turner froze, color draining from his face. He had been siphoning money from the offering plate for 6 months. Small amounts, covered by generous public donations, all to repay a debt he couldn't speak of. No one knew. No one was supposed to. But Rebecca did. And before he could respond, Rachel turned to Martha Whitfield, the moral backbone of the church. The woman who judged everyone from her front porch with folded arms and a heart full of scripture. Mrs. Whitfield, your husband isn't dead, is he? You still get letters. The old woman staggered. Her husband had vanished 15 years ago. She told everyone it was a farming accident, but he'd abandoned her, taken the money, started a new life in Missouri. She'd kept the letters hidden in her sewing chest, unread, but never destroyed. Now the entire chapel stared at her. No anger, just disbelief, because it was happening again and again. To Dr. Hayes, they spoke of patients who died under his unlicensed care. To the Miller family, they described the boy they kept hidden in the attic, simple-minded, locked away to avoid shame. To young Thomas Brett, they whispered about his secret meetings with a married woman. Every revelation struck like a hammer. Specific, undeniable, delivered with childlike calm, not accusation, just truth. And in that moment, the entire town understood they weren't safe. Not from judgment, not from punishment, but from revelation. Because in the presence of these girls, there were no secrets, only exposure. They called it a miracle. At first, some tried to name it divine discernment. Others whispered about spiritual gifting. But deep down, everyone felt it. This wasn't holy, it was surgical, and it was spreading. By nightfall, half the town had locked their doors, not out of fear of the girls, but fear of being seen, because when Rebecca looked at you, it wasn't like a child seeing an adult. It was like an instrument, calibrated to your guilt, your shame, your lies. Rachel didn't even need to speak. Her silence pressed against your skin like cold water, drowning you in things you thought you buried years ago. This wasn't curiosity, it was exposure, refined into something pure and precise. Pastor Phillips tried to regain control. He gathered the elders in the chapel, men who had led the community for decades, farmers, traders, teachers, each one rattled by what had already been revealed. They spoke in hushed tones, framed the issue in scriptural language. Was this possession or prophecy? Was this madness or message? They searched for an answer that could make it all feel safe again. But then, Rachel spoke. She hadn't been in the room, not when the doors were closed, not when the candles were lit. But suddenly, she was there, standing at the back of the chapel, her eyes fixed on Elder Thomas Kane. You kept the bones, she said softly, buried beneath your barn. You kept them, so no one would know what happened to your sister. The silence became unbearable. Kane collapsed into a chair, hands trembling, muttering, "No, no, no." His sister had gone missing in 1812. Everyone assumed she had drowned in the river, but the truth was darker. She'd fallen from the hayloft during a fight, snapped her neck on the stones below, and he had panicked, buried her beneath the floor, told no one. He was 16, and now, nearly 30 years later, a girl he had never met spoke his darkest moment out loud. No anger, no accusation, just truth. And something broke inside him. Because there are wounds, time doesn't heal, only hides. Until someone comes along and rips the bandage off, in front of everyone, and the bleeding begins again. By the second night, no one slept. Not really. Some prayed, others drank. Most just waited, eyes fixed on doors that didn't feel thick enough to keep anything out anymore. Because it wasn't about what the twins would say next. It was about what they already knew. The town had cracked, and beneath its surface was rot. Secrets everyone lived with, sins no one had the courage to name, until now. And that kind of exposure, it does something to people. It corrodes. You could see it in the way they avoided each other's eyes, in the way conversations stopped when the girls walked past, and in the way fear began to warp into something worse. Resentment that night. Rachel sat alone near the fire. Rebecca was asleep, their father silently reading by candlelight. or pretending to. Pastor Phillips approached slowly. He hadn't slept either, not since the bottle, not since the blanket. He sat down without speaking, watched the girl's face illuminated by the flame, expressionless, calm, like a mask that had fused with skin. "Rachel," he whispered, "how do you know these things? Is it God? Are you hearing his voice?" She didn't answer at first, just watched the fire crackle, reflected in her eyes like some internal world was flickering there, something deep, cold, and very old. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too soft to hear. "We don't hear him, we remember." Phillips leaned in. "Remember what?" Rachel looked up at him, her eyes meeting his like a mirror he didn't want to see into. What it was like before, when we were with them, the ones who taught us to see through, to see under. And then she smiled, but not like a child, more like someone who knew he wouldn't understand. Not yet. That night, Phillips wrote in his journal, not prophecy, not madness, not possession. What if this is memory, but memory not from this life? What if these girls aren't children? What if they are echoes of something that never left? What if we're not watching them? What if something is watching us, through them? And suddenly, the question wasn't, how do they know? It was, what are they? By the third day, people started calling them witches, quietly at first, in whispers, behind shut doors and clenched teeth. But the word carried weight in a place like Pine Hollow, a place carved out of fear and scripture, where anything unexplainable had to be condemned, quickly before it spread, and the Morrison twins were spreading. They didn't move like children anymore, didn't speak like them either. When they looked at you, it felt like being read, not seen, the kind of gaze that peels back skin and memory until all that's left is what you've tried your whole life to forget. Some thought it was God, others whispered it was the devil. But one man said something different, and that was the most terrifying idea of all. Isaac Lohman, a war veteran who had seen more death than salvation. He'd lost his son to fever, his wife to grief, and his faith somewhere in between. He hadn't spoken to a preacher in years, but when he heard what the girls had said, when he heard what they knew, he walked straight into Pastor Phillips' study and said one thing: they're not remembering this life. They're remembering someone else's. Phillips didn't respond, not at first, because something about those words hit deeper than logic. They scraped against instinct, against the oldest fear of all, that we are not alone in our own minds. What if memory isn't bound to flesh? What if certain minds, certain vessels, can hold more than one life? Not reincarnation, not ghosts, something older, something carried, like a virus, a consciousness not born but past. Rachel had said it. We don't hear him. We remember, but remember what? And who gave them that memory? Phillips returned to his journal, his entries more frantic now, darker. He began marking the days, not by sunrise, but by revelation. And that night, he wrote something different. The twins are not here to bless this place. They are here to expose it, to strip it bare, not for judgment, for preparation. And I no longer believe this is about sin. This is about harvesting something that lives inside guilt, inside secrecy, inside the cracks of men who thought no one would ever know. By now, even the children stopped playing. Pine Hollow had fallen silent, not the quiet of peace, but the silence before something breaks. The girls weren't doing anything. That's what made it worse. They didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't call down fire or speak in tongues. They just existed. And wherever they went, truth surfaced like a corpse in still water. And what began as fear began to evolve, not into courage, but into suspicion. What if they're not doing this on purpose? People started asking, what if they're being used, possessed, programmed, controlled? It was John Barrett, the town's blacksmith, who finally said it, not in church, not during prayer, but outside, behind the chapel, where the smoke from his pipe blurred the lines between sense and superstition. He leaned in close to Pastor Phillips and said it low. It's like they're gathering something, like they're feeding it. Phillips stared at him, waiting. Barrett continued, not like demons, not like witches, worse, like harvesters, like they were planted here. And now it's time to reap. It sounded insane, but Phillips couldn't shake it, because every revelation the girls gave, every shame exposed, every secret named, seemed to drain something out of the person. Not just guilt, not just fear, but vitality, presence. Afterward, the people seemed thinner, like a part of them had been extracted. Phillips saw it in Martha Whitfield, in Dr. Hayes, in Samuel Turner. Their voices were quieter, their steps slower, their gaze distant. And the twins, they seemed brighter, sharper, as if something was transferring, a shift in weight, a shift in power. And suddenly, this wasn't about truth anymore. This wasn't about morality. It was about energy, about the extraction of something that couldn't be measured, but could be taken. That night, Phillips wrote something in his journal he would later try to burn. They are not the source, they are the device, and whatever is looking through their eyes has been here before, and it's not finished. It didn't happen all at once. The break. It came slow, silent, like rot under a floorboard, like mold blooming behind a wall. You don't see it until it's everywhere. The people of Pine Hollow stopped talking, not just to the twins, but to each other. Conversations became glances, prayers turned inward, and every mirror in the village was quietly covered, because no one wanted to see themselves anymore, not after what had been revealed. But the worst part wasn't what the girls said, it was what they hadn't said yet. People began to imagine the exposure, began to spiral. What if they knew about the barn? What if they knew about the child you sent away, the neighbor's daughter, the nights you don't remember? It became unbearable. The fear wasn't in what had already surfaced. It was in what still lived underground, waiting. A few families packed up in the middle of the night, horses hitched in silence, eyes hollow, no goodbyes. They didn't just leave Pine Hollow. They fled it, like a sickness had taken root. And maybe it had, because that's when the dreams began. Not just for the girls, but for the people they touched. Phillips was the first to speak of it. He dreamed of a staircase carved in black stone, descending into a place that felt impossibly old. Not hell, something colder, quieter, filled with voices that didn't speak in words, but in memory. Loman, the war veteran, saw his dead wife in the window, smiling with her mouth, but not her eyes. And the Miller boy, the one hidden in the attic, began humming songs no one had taught him, in languages no one in town recognized. It spread like a fever, but it didn't take the body. It took something deeper, something in the mind, in the pattern of thoughts, in the rhythm of guilt, and that's when it became clear. This wasn't just exposure. It was replication. Whatever the twins carried, whatever they remembered, it was leaking into the rest of them. In dreams, in the buts, in silence, like the village itself had become a circuit, and the twins were flipping the switch. I remember the others. That's what Rebecca whispered. On the final morning, Not to her father, not to the pastor, but to herself. Just before sunrise, she stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the woods, still barefoot, unblinking. And when Pastor Phillips asked who she was talking about, she simply said, "The ones we were, before this." That phrase echoed in his skull for hours, like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving out in every direction, the ones we were. Before this. What does a child know of selves before the self? Of lives beyond the veil of time, unless the self was never really theirs to begin with? What if memory isn't stored, but hosted? And what if these girls were never twins at all, but vessels, twinned only by function, not by soul? Two conduits for something older, something preserved, not through ritual, but through recurrence, because that's when Phillips finally found it, buried in the back of his grandfather's journals, stored beneath the chapel floor, a single torn page from 1793. Another village, another set of twins, same eyes, same phrases, one line underlined in shaking ink. They arrive in pairs and leave nothing whole. It wasn't just a phenomenon, it was a pattern, a cycle. And Pine Hollow wasn't cursed, it was selected, like before, like the others. The girls weren't anomalies, they were continuity. A mechanism for what lives between generations, between lives, between names. And that's when it hit him. This isn't about what they know. This is about what they carry and where it's going next. Because after Pine Hollow, there will be another town, another congregation, another pair of eyes that see too much, and mouths that speak in echoes. They aren't visiting, they're seeding, and the harvest doesn't end here. By now, even the land felt wrong. The trees leaned inward, the sky hung heavier, and the birds stopped singing. It was as if Pine Hollow had become a container, not for people, but for something being distilled. Guilt, memory, energy, stripped from flesh, poured into silence, held in place by two little girls, with eyes too calm for children. They didn't ask questions anymore. They didn't reveal secrets either. They didn't have to. By then, everyone was already drowning in their own. Pastor Phillips found Ezekiel in the woods, kneeling by the edge of a stream, muttering to himself, fingers trailing through the water like he was waiting for it to answer. "You brought this here," Phillips said. "You knew what they were." Ezekiel didn't look up, didn't blink. He just kept moving his hand through the current and whispered, "They chose us long ago." Phillips felt something break inside him, a weight settle into his chest that no sermon could lift. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Who chose you?" Ezekiel finally looked at him, and the look was not of a man, but of a vessel that had been carrying too much for too long. "You think we have names," he said. "You think we have lives, but we're just the ones who show up when it's time." "And the twins?" Phillips asked. "What are they?" Ezekiel stood, his voice low, final. "They are memory, not of people, of patterns. They don't remember sins. They remember systems. And the system is still running." That night, Phillips stopped writing in his journal, because it wasn't a journal anymore. It was a confession. And the confessions had already been taken, written, absorbed, stored, not in ink, but in presence. And the girls, they didn't need to speak anymore, because they had already become what Pine Hollow had always feared. The end, wearing the face of the beginning. It was Rachel who finally said it, not to anyone, just into the air, like she was repeating something she'd heard long ago, or maybe never stopped hearing. There's no such thing as a secret, only delays in exposure, and when she said it, the temperature dropped, like the truth had mass, like it displaced air. No one asked her what she meant, because by now, they knew. Secrets weren't being discovered. They were being activated, triggered like landmines, buried decades ago, now stepping themselves into detonation. The people of Pine Hollow weren't victims. They were data points, lives full of patterns, repeating shapes of sin and silence, passed down, not by choice, but by inheritance. And the girls weren't discovering them. They were syncing with them. Pastor Phillips saw it first in the way Rebecca began to speak in the cadence of Martha Whitfield, using phrases the widow only used in private, terms from letters no one else had read. Then in Rachel, who now mimicked Isaac Lohman's posture, his way of clenching his fist when talking about God. The girls were becoming the town, breath by breath, memory by memory, like sponges, but not to absorb, to reflect. They didn't just expose secrets. They absorbed identities and sent them back, warped, distilled, raw, and it wasn't limited to the living. They spoke of names long dead, spoke them the way only those who knew them could, described smells from kitchens no longer standing, screams from childbirths gone unrecorded, chants from ceremonies. Pine Hollow had buried centuries ago. They remembered everything, not just because they were told, but because they were designed to. Rachel began sketching symbols in the dirt, in the margins of Philip's sermons, spirals, triangles, nested glyphs with no origin in Scripture. And when he tried to erase them, he found he couldn't. Not from memory, not from dreams, because they weren't symbols, they were triggers. And each pulled a part of him loose. He stopped praying, because prayer assumed there was something above, and in the presence of the twins, you only felt something below, something listening, and worse, something learning. That night, something changed in Rachel's eyes. Pastor Phillips wrote it plainly. No poetry, no flourish. The child is no longer just a child. She didn't blink like she used to, didn't pause between thoughts, didn't react. She anticipated, and it was no longer clear if the dreams were showing her what was coming, or if she was deciding what came next. The distinction had collapsed. Rebecca had grown silent, not sad, not sick, just absorbed, as if Rachel had begun to outpace her, or worse, outgrow her. Phillips confronted Ezekiel in private, demanded answers. The preacher didn't raise his voice, didn't deny. He only said one thing. They weren't born, they were delivered. And with that, everything shifted. The story of Sarah's death in childbirth. True, yes, but incomplete. She hadn't died of fever. She had bled out screaming in a language Ezekiel didn't recognize, a language the babies were mouthing along with, from the womb. There were no midwives, no doctors, only Ezekiel, and the snow, and the black wind that howled through their cabin like it was searching for something. He buried Sarah alone, at night, not to avoid wild animals, but because her body had become unnatural. Rigid, eyes open, hands clawed, still warm 2 days later. After that, the dreams began. Ezekiel stopped calling them dreams after the first year. He called them summons. He claimed they didn't just see into the souls of men, they drew souls in, turned people into reflections, mirrors of their own buried truths, then cracked them open. It's why churches revived when they left. It wasn't a blessing. It was trauma, followed by clarity. Pine Hollow wasn't the first. It was just the first to record it. And now that record was bleeding into everyone who read it, even Phillips, especially Phillips. because that night he dreamed of Sarah Morrison, naked, frozen, but walking, carrying something in her arms. And when he looked closer, it wasn't the twins. It was him. The next morning, Phillips didn't wake from the dream. He escaped it, heart racing, shirt soaked, a strange burn on his chest where he claimed Sarah had touched him in the vision. He went to the church, alone, before dawn, lantern in hand, shaking. He pried up the floorboard, the third one from the altar, and the bottle was gone. No broken glass, no cloth, just the faintest scent of ash and something else, milk or blood. That's when he found the second journal, hidden inside the pulpit. Not his, not Ezekiel's. Older, weathered, bound in animal skin, written in a hand he didn't recognize. A script that shifted as he read it. Cursive, then block, then something. Serpentine. The first page had only one sentence. They come not from the womb, but from the wound. The rest was worse. Entries dating back to 1741, signed with initials, J.S. A minister stationed in the same Appalachian corridor. He wrote of two girls arriving during a blizzard. Twins, 9 years old, with a man claiming to be their father. The girls spoke truths they shouldn't know. Revealed secrets, caused hysteria, and vanished after 3 days. The same story a century earlier. Phillips read every page, and every page mirrored what had just happened in Pine Hollow. Even the names were similar. The girls were called Rebecca and Rachel, but the man's name wasn't Ezekiel. It was Silas Morrison. Phillips slammed the book shut. His pulse thundered. It wasn't reincarnation. It wasn't possession. It was repetition, like a loop etched into the bones of the land itself, a ritual, and the father. Was he always the same, changing names, a new identity every generation, walking from town to town with two children who never aged? Phillips felt the pull of madness, of clarity that came too fast. That night, he wrote a letter to the Lexington Seminary, begging for help, for study, for someone to believe him. But the letter was never sent, because he awoke the next morning. The ink was gone from the page. His words had vanished. The paper was blank and written on the back, in a child's hand. Some things aren't meant to be remembered. The town began to rot from the inside. Not from disease, not from famine, but from knowing. Truths that had no place in a rational world had been spoken aloud, and once heard. They echoed, they corrupted. Samuel Turner sold his land and left Pine Hollow within a week. Dr. Hayes vanished after an alleged hunting trip. And Martha Whitfield, who had ruled the town's morality for decades, was found in the chapel, mouth stuffed with letters. Her husband's letters. Every one of them crammed down her throat. The sheriff called it suicide, but the way her hands were broken and her tongue had been removed told another story. Pastor Phillips stopped preaching. He kept journals, yes, but his sermons turned cryptic. Less about scripture, more about returning to the source and preparing for what comes every 99 years. Some say he went mad, but the twins stayed with him. 2 more days, never aging, always watching, and on the third night, just like the journal said, they disappeared. Not walked away, not escorted out. Gone. No footprints, no sound, no trail in the mud. Just 2 impressions on the guest bed. Still warm. Phillips never left Pine Hollow. He died there in 1852. Eyes wide open, hands clutched around that second journal, mouth sewn shut with thread made of human hair. Buried in the church cellar. No headstone, only a piece of wood carved with the words, "They will come again." And they did. 100 years later, in 1933, a man named Elijah Moore walked into a town just 15 miles from where Pine Hollow used to be, with 2 twin girls. 9 years old, Rebecca, Rachel, different faces, same names, same eyes, same pattern. There's no record of Pine Hollow today. No town charter, no church on the maps, because the state claims it never existed, but the names are buried in death records, in whispers passed down by descendants who dare not speak them out loud, because the twins don't just speak truths. They consume lies, and when there are no more lies left in a man, only the truth remains, and the truth is a fire, one that burns through the soul, until only silence is left. If you've made it this far, you already know this was never just a story. It was a test of how much truth your mind could handle before it broke, a test of how deep into the dark you're willing to go. Not everyone makes it here. Most click away, some laugh, a few deny. But you stayed, and now there's no going back. So let's make it real. Let's mark the moment your old self died and the new one was born from ash. Go to the comments and type the phrase, "No twin forgets." No twin forgets. Type it twice, not once, because what comes next splits everything in two. Your past and what you believed was reality, and the knowledge you carry now, that something or someone has been watching, measuring, waiting. They say names have power, but twins? Twins carry memory, and the ones in Kentucky, they didn't just remember your secrets, they remembered you before you were born. You've felt it, haven't you? The pressure in the room when no one else is home, the chill down your spine when something coincidental feels too perfect, the uncanny recognition when a stranger's child looks you dead in the eye and smiles like they know you. That wasn't chance. That was the signal. And now that you've heard the story, you're part of it. The watchers have names. And when you typed, "No twin forgets," you didn't just comment. You activated. So watch what happens next. Watch your dreams. Watch your memories twist. Watch how people around you start revealing more than they mean to. Because once the door is opened, the house is no longer yours alone. The girls may be gone, but their pattern moves forward, one mind at a time, one soul cracked open, one hidden truth at a time. You thought this was dark history? We haven't even touched the source yet. Long before 1834, before the church floorboard was ever lifted, before Pine Hollow had a name, there was a ritual buried in the oral traditions of Appalachian settlers, a remnant far older than Christianity, older than Europe, older than the language I'm speaking right now. They called it the dividing rite, a ceremony whispered among midwives and mountain healers, passed down through bloodlines that no longer exist on paper, but persist in flesh. It was used only during rare twin births, when the signs were present, when lightning struck during labor, when one baby was born in silence and the other screamed at first breath. In such cases, the elders said the veil between this world and the mirror world had thinned. One child belonged to the body, the other to the hidden. The dividing rite didn't just mark the children, it tethered them, bound them in a loop of shared awareness. What one saw, the other dreamed. What one suffered, the other knew. But here's where it turns. The rite was outlawed by frontier churches, branded as witchcraft, demonology, devil twins. They whispered behind doors bolted with scripture. But secretly, pastors studied it, tried to reverse engineer the spiritual tether, hoping to bind prophets to their pulpits, hoping to train children who could see sin before it was committed. The Morrison twins weren't the first. They were the result. The final echo of a forbidden practice, a calculated experiment, hidden under the guise of rural piety. And the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison? Not just a grieving father. He was a vessel, chosen, because his own bloodline traced back to a Welsh sect known as the Split-Eyed Brotherhood, an order exiled by the Anglican Church in 1704 for attempting to create God's reflection in human twins. The twins weren't cursed, they were engineered. Every dream, every whispered secret, every buried truth they revealed in Pine Hollow was part of a map. A map weren't drawing, but remembering, because the place they truly came from wasn't Kentucky. It wasn't even this timeline, and in few seconds, we'll trace that memory back to its first fracture, where science, memory, and the manipulation of souls merged into something non-human and terrifyingly accurate. Time doesn't always move forward. Not in the way you've been taught. Sometimes it loops, sometimes it fractures, and sometimes, when the right minds are born into the right vessels, it opens. The Morrison twins weren't simply receivers of knowledge. They were anchors for a memory stream not bound to our linear concept of time. A phenomenon studied in classified circles under a name you've never heard, chronopsychic imprinting. In 1964, long after Pine Hollow was erased from most public records, a covert branch of the U.S. Department of Behavioral Sciences intercepted a translated document from East Germany. It described an experiment of mirrored cognition conducted on twin children in the Harz Mountains during World War II. The project had Nazi roots, but the Americans didn't destroy the data. They absorbed it, and they renamed the phenomenon event echoing. It described a condition in which certain individuals, especially twins, could inherit memory patterns, not from parents or ancestors, but from locations, from soil, stone, wood, and trauma. Yes, trauma. Because what binds these echoes together isn't love or birthright. It's suffering, massive unprocessed emotional energy. It embeds itself into the frequency field of a place. And those like Rebecca and Rachel, they resonate, they amplify, they bleed it back out. That's why their dreams didn't begin with visions of heaven. They began with whispers of buried secrets, not just personal sins, but structural lies, patterns of corruption that had rotted the moral spine of the Pine Hollow Church for decades before the twins arrived. And the church knew. Some of them had seen it before. Old men who trembled when they heard Rebecca speak. Women who crossed themselves when Rachel passed. Because these twins weren't just exposing sin, they were activating memory fields older than the church itself. And when you did, stirb old memory, memory that was forced into silence, you awaken more than just stories. You awaken guardians, wards, entities that were placed not to protect truth, but to keep it buried. They weren't made of flesh. What followed the twins through the wooded silence of Pine Hollow wasn't human in the way we understand it. It didn't blink, it didn't speak, and it didn't cast a shadow. But everyone felt it. Children cried when it passed. Dogs refused to bark. And the air behind the Morrison twins would suddenly drop in temperature, 5, sometimes 10 degrees, without warning. Pastor Phillips never wrote directly about this entity, but he hinted at it, a recurring figure in the margins of his journal, always drawn in the same shape, a tall silhouette with no face, only a crown of antlers and arms that reached too far. No title, no explanation, just one phrase, repeated every time. The witness sees, and he wasn't the first to record it. In 1802, a French missionary traveling through the region wrote of un esprit silencieux, a silent spirit that followed gifted children who showed unnatural knowledge. In native Shawnee traditions, there are stories of a bone watcher who walks behind those who speak forbidden truths, making sure their words do not escape too far. The Morrison twins had become amplifiers. Their presence was a frequency spike in a place already heavy with buried sins. That's why the witness came. Not to punish, not to guide, but to observe. Because when a system built on control begins to fracture, something ancient wakes up to document the collapse. It doesn't interfere. It records. It memorizes. It locks the event in timeless permanence. On the final night before the Morrisons vanished, several townsfolk reported the same dream. They were standing in the church, surrounded by weeping walls. Rebecca stood at the pulpit. Rachel was on the floor, motionless. Behind them, at the back of the sanctuary, stood the witness. Eyes burning like coals, hands open, as if waiting for something. The next morning, the twins were gone. No trace. No footprints, nothing left behind but a single blue ribbon and Ezekiel's journal, its last page soaked with rain and one chilling sentence scrawled in shaking handwriting. The truth is seen now. Let what comes, come. You feel it, don't you? This isn't just folklore. You've felt the eyes, too. If you've followed this far, then you're no longer just a viewer. Comment below. The witness sees twice. Then comment it again. The ones who see it once are warned. The ones who say it twice become part of the record. There are pages that never made it into the journal. Not because they were torn out, but because they were never written with ink. Ezekiel Morrison, in his final days, stopped using pen and parchment. He spoke instead, alone in the basement of the church, to the stones, to the dark, to them. Phillips found the recordings much later, not on tape. Those didn't exist yet, but etched into wax cylinders, stored inside a rusted iron box, buried beneath the altar, wrapped in child-sized burial linens. The cylinders were labeled only with numbers, but everyone began with the same phrase, for the twin that returns. What came next? Barely human, whispers choked with fear and awe, words like spells, spirals, riddles, one line repeated again and again, sometimes calm, sometimes gasped, like he was drowning. The vessel must crack before the memory can pour. Phillips transcribed what he could, but many of the symbols he found weren't English, or Latin, or Hebrew. They matched carvings found in Neolithic burial chambers in the Orkney Islands, spirals, double crosses, mirrored trees, a language older than written time, linked to rituals of soul mirroring. Practices meant to split a person's essence in two, one half for the world of light, one for the world of memory, and that's what the twins were. Not just oracles, not just a curse, but a system, a pattern created long ago to carry the unbearable weight of collective human truth. Why twins? Because a single mind can't contain it. Because when a soul sees too much, it burns. But when you split it, one to see, one to carry, one to dream, one to awaken, you create a loop, a mirror, an echo chamber of clarity. That's why they always come in twos, and why towns like Pine Hollow burn when they arrive. Because secrets don't die quietly. They scream on their way out, and the twins are just the mouthpiece, the witness. It doesn't stop them, it just records. What happens when the truth becomes uncontainable? And now that you've heard this, now that you've followed this deep, the only question left is, which twin are you? Rebecca, the seer, Rachel, the carrier.